Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation around VOCA. We're going to just take a few more minutes and let people trickle in, and then we'll get started. We still have a few people showing up, so we'll just wait a couple minutes. All right, why don't we get started so we can make the most of our time. Again, thank you for joining us for today's conversation around VOCA, the challenges with the Crime Victims Fund, and the upcoming VOCA reductions. I know it's a heck of a way to start a Tuesday. I'm sorry, but I'm really grateful that you joined us today. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce you to all of the panelists today. We have Jesse Aquino, who's MOVA's Director of Victim Services. We have Kristen Patrikas-Wynn, who's our Director of Grants Administration. And we also have Stephanie McCarthy, who's our Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs. And in case you don't know me, my name's Liam Lowney. I'm the Director at MOVA, and I'm really thrilled to be with you today. Just a couple housekeeping items. I wanted to let you know that this webinar session is being recorded and will be accessible following today's session on our YouTube channel, which is shocking to me that we have a YouTube channel, but it's pretty exciting. We will send a follow-up email to all of the attendees with that link in the next few days. Additionally, Brenna Chase and Charlotte Hoff from MOVA will be monitoring the chat box today, so please feel free to reach out to them if you're experiencing any technical difficulties whatsoever. Before you all joined us today, you completed a registration form that gave you the opportunity to ask us questions about the upcoming VOCA reductions. Let me just start by saying that thank you for taking the time to submit those questions. For the purposes of this session today, we're going to spend about half the time answering those questions we already received. And the questions really were grouped together. I mean, it was really great because it allowed us to structure our discussion this morning in a way that really got to what you wanted to know. And we put them together thematically and tried to avoid duplication. We will use the remainder of the time, though, to answer new questions that you have based on this morning or the ones you showed up with today. And for that, I'm going to ask that you please use the Q&A function to submit any questions you'd like answered during the session. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started by talking about what's going on with VOCA, what's the picture, and why are we, all here today. So the Federal Crime Victims Fund was established by the Victims of Crime Act in 1984. And for many of you, this is review, I know. But I want to make sure we all kind of understand the base of where VOCA comes from. So the Crime Victims Fund was derived from fines and fees resulting from prosecutions in the United States federal courts. VOCA itself serves as a major funding source for victim services across the nation through all 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. And through state grant awards, it funds the crime victim compensation programs in all of our states, and it also supports victim assistance services and programming through what's known as a state administrator. And MOVA serves as the VOCA administrator for Massachusetts, and we award grants, VOCA grants, to support free services to crime victims. So several years ago, Congress increased the amount of money available to states from the Crime Victims Fund, which has been amazing. Thanks to these efforts, MOVA was able to make significantly larger awards to fund programs beginning in fiscal year 16. Just to give you a sense, we went from approximately 8 million in annual funding to approximately 69 million. And as a result of this multi-year increase in funding, MOVA has been able to support new and innovative services that empower crime victims and survivors. What you all, many of you are here, you service providers have done with this funding to make a difference in the lives of crime victims has been amazing. It's always been amazing, and I know you do it regardless of whether the dollars are there, but some of the innovation that has been allowed by having extra funding has been really remarkable to be part of and partner with you on. Unfortunately, the Crime Victims Fund, and therefore VOCA, has experienced a reduction in available funds for programming and services nationally. This is due to the fact that while Congress raised the amount of funding available to all of the states, there was actually a significant decrease in fines and fee deposits from the Justice Department over the last several years. And we're working nationally to fix some of the issues that have led to this decrease in deposits, and Stephanie McCarthy will talk about that shortly. However, the damage, as they say, for now is done. And in every state in the US and territory, we're all facing reductions. Thankfully, MOVA and our board, working with you, have always budgeted VOCA awards to support multiple grant cycles so that Massachusetts hasn't yet felt the impact of these reductions. Several of our colleagues nationally began reducing programming funding to their programs last year. But while we will be facing that impact soon, I'm pleased that we're here together today to begin talking about them and how we can work together to support survivors and weather this, hopefully as a community. So moving to some of our questions, one recurring question we've received from many of you was, is the reduction amount known yet? So I'm going to ask Kristen if you wouldn't mind responding to that question.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for Liam for the introduction. So to answer this question, the answer is yes, we're aware of the reduction to MOVA's federal award. So following federal fiscal year 2018, MOVA's VOCA award has decreased an average of 31% each award cycle. And we're currently projecting that in the fiscal year 2021, that we will experience a 35% reduction in our Massachusetts VOCA award. So Brenna will be dropping a PDF in the chat to give all of our attendees today a visual. And this document is a projection chart that outlines where we are, or where we were, where we are, and where we're heading with this cut. At this time, we know that due to the federal award reductions, programs will see a reduction in their awards beginning July 2022. We understand that you may be wondering what this means for your organization, but what we're here to talk about today is that we need more information from stakeholders to help us determine the funding priorities in a time of reduced capacity. So we're asking you all to help us understand the most critical needs. Jesse will speak more about this later in our conversation about ways that you all can help. As we work to determine the future funding priorities, we're also here today to bring awareness to our audience that this is coming. And so you can all be part of the conversation for the next 18 months. So another question that we've received from multiple attendees is, when exactly will this reduction impact program funding? So we anticipate being able to meet our current contracts with our currently funded VOCA and Safe Plan programs, which goes through June 2022. So the FY22 awards are set and will not change, and your funding is secured for FY22. The reduction in available funding will impact contracts effective July 2022, which is the start of state fiscal year 2023. It's important to note that we do not consider the supplemental procurements which occurred in FY20 and FY21 as part of an agency's FY22 award. So a few examples of the supplemental procurements that we have conducted over FY20 and FY21 were the COVID emergency awards, some supplemental housing funding, Access to Victim Rights Award, and training grant awards, and the technology awards. So these were all separate and distinct procurements from currently funded programs, and they're separate from the traditional VOCA funding awards when we reference the award amounts in FY22. So with the exception of the training grant, these awards are set to expire on June 30th, 2021, all of the supplemental awards. And in an effort to be as transparent as possible, we're confident that every program will be facing some reduction in their contract beginning July 2022. But at this time, we're not certain the individual program reductions and what they will look like at this time. And as we try to plan for this reduction, we are planning a one-year renewal for contracts for July 2022 to July 2023. And you'll be able to see that in the timeline that Brenna has provided. And then we will hold a competitive open procurement in winter 2022, and those contracts would begin July 1st, 2023. And those contracts would reflect the reductions that we're discussing during today's session.
Great. Thanks, Kristen, for that clarification. And I wanted to clarify based on a question that I received that earlier I'd noted we went from about 8 million to 69 million, and there was a question about, is that 69 million in a year, or is that 69 million over multiple years? MOVA for the past couple of years has averaged just north of $40 million in grants a year. At the time that we did the 69 million, that was 2-year contracts to programs, and we also have had some off-cycle awards for legal services and the like that actually increase the amount of dollars that are out there. We did put into the chat for you a chart that lays out the awards that MOVA receives from the federal government, so you can see the change and the how that's gone up and down since FY 2013. And so we've really tried to keep it level and manage it over a few years. So hopefully that answers that question. And to answer another question that has come up, is this a done deal or is this not? The awards that Massachusetts has from the federal government are the awards that we're going to be spending over the next several years are done. And in those awards, we have seen significant reductions. And that's what you'll see if you look at the awards that MOVA, that we put in the chat. So those awards are done, and we have to work within the context of the awards that we have. Stephanie, again, is going to talk about the fix that we're trying to do to the Crime Victims Fund that hopefully will increase awards we get in the future. But we have received 3 decreases over the last 3 years because of the depleting funds in the Crime Victims Fund. So hopefully that gets to that question. So now that we've kind of talked about when this is happening, I'm sure you're wondering how. One question we've received from multiple attendees in advance was, how is MOVA developing priorities for funding? And if so, what are they? So Jesse Aquino is gonna take a stab at that question. Jesse?
Thank you, Liam. And good morning, everyone. So that actually is a big question. And the truth is that MOVA can't do it alone. So MOVA has contracted with an outside consultant, ICF, to conduct a statewide needs assessment to help us understand the critical needs of survivors and programs across the Commonwealth. This effort is currently in progress and will help us in determining priorities. So in order to collect the data needed to inform priority areas, we ask that you opt into engagement opportunities around this assessment. As I mentioned, MOVA can't do this in isolation, and we ask that programs as well as survivors provide the valuable input needed to better identify those areas. Later this spring, programs will receive a survey from our consultant at ICF. Again, we ask that you complete it and share it broadly with your networks, because the more data we gather, the better. And the information we collect will help us determine where there are service gaps and where we're overfunding services based on crime type, geography, marginalized communities, et cetera. ICF will also offer focus groups for victims and survivors later this summer. You all can get more information about this engagement in the session following this one. It begins at 11:30, and Brenna will drop the Zoom registration link in the chat in case you're interested in joining. Another question that we received is, what is the impact of reverting funding? So just to be clear, reverting funding right now is not helpful. If you anticipate that your program will be reverting funding this year, please reach out to your grant managers to strategize allowable ways to spend down the funding. MOVA grant managers are a great resource to you, and they're always helpful and available to help you.
Thanks, Jesse. I would say on the reverted funding point, you know, the reason for that is our federal award is up in the end of September. And so that money will go back to the feds if you revert it to us. So the sooner we know that you're gonna, if you have a program that you think you may have some reverted dollars, please let us know so we can put them to use. I would rather use those dollars to serve victims in Massachusetts than send them back to the Office for Victims of Crime. And they would prefer that as well, I should let you know too. And thanks, Jesse, for talking about the needs assessment. That is gonna be used by us to help inform many of these priorities. But I also want to be clear that that's something we can give back to you for you to use as you look towards other funding sources and other support of the work that you do. So we're gathering the information, but we do intend to share it broadly and share it with you for you to use for your purposes as well. And many of you have inquired about alternate funding sources and the opportunity to engage in advocacy around the Crime Victims VOCA fix. So Stephanie, will you take a moment and speak to these questions?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you, Liam. As he had mentioned, that many of you had asked, what is this VOCA fix that MOVA keeps talking about, and how does it fix the anticipated cuts that we're talking about today? The VOCA fix is a bill that is currently pending before Congress that proposes critical changes to the Victims of Crime Act statute that would bring in additional dollars to the Crime Victims Fund and give states more flexibility in managing and budgeting their VOCA awards. The most significant piece of the bill would redirect monetary penalties that result from deferred and non-prosecution agreements through the Department of Justice into the Crime Victims Fund. Currently, those penalties are being directed straight to the General Treasury. And just to give you a little bit of context, since January 1st of this year of 2021, approximately $2.5 billion has already been directed to the Treasury through these agreements that could otherwise be going into the fund to benefit survivors. The bill also increases the federal contribution to state victim compensation programs by 15%. Currently, the federal government is reimbursing at 60%, and this bill would increase that to 75%. And there's a few other small but vital updates to the bill, but we are very optimistic that this will redirect some additional funds into the Crime Victims Fund. Passage of this VOCA fix, however, will not immediately impact the reductions in VOCA programs. It will, however, provide a mechanism to build the fund back up in the future and give states like Massachusetts more flexibility to manage our awards. So as we are working to pass this bill, we received many questions about how programs and stakeholders can help advocate. The US House passed the bill by a vote of 384 to 38 on March 17th. And right now we are awaiting action from the Senate. Our entire Massachusetts House delegation voted in favor of the bill, and Senators Warren and Markey have already publicly supported the bill and are named co-sponsors in the Senate. We are committed to providing you as allies and stakeholders with the most up-to-date information that we have on the bill, which also will include opportunities to advocate and support. Although we as MOVA have been in communication with our federal delegation, it is so important for their offices to also hear from you. So we encourage you to contact the delegation to educate their offices on what VOCA supports in their communities and how critical this funding is to continue serving victims of crime. Social and traditional media can also be powerful tools in highlighting the importance of this bill. Through some of our previous messages that you may have received, we have circulated a toolkit that was compiled by our national stakeholder organization, NAVA, and a combination of other victim service stakeholders that includes draft op-eds, letters to the editor, templates, and social media content that you might find useful to share within your own networks and communities. Brenna will be sharing the link to the toolkit in the chat for anybody who may be interested in getting involved. And we're also working with the stakeholder community to co-host a virtual advocacy day later this month. We're anticipating that it will occur in the third week of April during National Crime Victim Rights Week, but as soon as we have confirmation, we will share that with you. And in addition, this toolkit will be updated with those materials to share during this opportunity. So as we move from advocacy, we have to talk what other forms of federal or state funding may be available. And we want to share that we are actively monitoring what other funding streams may be available to absorb or lessen the impact of VOCA reductions. We're engaging with other state funders in Massachusetts who manage both federal and state grants serving victims of crime to identify how we can best utilize all existing victim service funding streams while mitigating these VOCA reductions to effectively represent all victims of crime throughout the Commonwealth. As we navigate those conversations, we're encouraging programs to begin exploring additional funding opportunities that may be available in future fiscal years, including private or public donations and the annual state budget process. Another moving piece that we are monitoring is the passage of the American Rescue Plan, which was passed by Congress last month and included $49.5 million to organizations to provide culturally specific services for victims and survivors of domestic abuse and sexual assault who have been impacted by COVID-19. We're right now working with the delegation to determine how much of that funding will be allocated to Massachusetts and what agency will be administering it. It's too early to determine how this funding may impact reductions, but we did want to make sure that we did highlight it and know that we are monitoring its progress and looking forward to having those conversations as they progress.
Thanks so much, Steph, for talking about that. And I did see a question come through that was that VOCA funded staff cannot lobby on VOCA time, of course, but they can and can they use the toolkit on their own time? And yes. So first of all, yes, thank you for the important clarification that no, there's no lobbying on VOCA funded time. But we're all citizens outside of our day job, and certainly please feel free to use any of the resources we put in the chat to help you in advocating for this Crime Victims Fund fix. We've been really fortunate in my role as president of the National Association of VOCA Assistance Administrators. We've really had a front row seat in these conversations, and right now is the time. Right now is we have an opportunity that we haven't had in a long time to get this discrepancy fixed. And so any support you all can offer here in Massachusetts or through your colleagues nationally, it's really important that all of the states and all of the senators hear about VOCA and the important work that it does. So thank you, Steph, for talking about what we're doing on that front. So we did receive some questions that were very specific about reductions and how they would impact specific agencies. So I did want to comment on that and acknowledge that those questions did come in, that we did get your questions about how it's going to impact your specific program. As previously mentioned by Kristen and later by Jesse, we need you to help us inform the priority areas by opting into our needs assessment. That's the first step. So we're not in a position to give answers to programs exactly about what the reduction is going to look like for any one specific program right now. But what we can tell you is that we will provide specific information about these reductions to you as soon as we have it. We really, I hope you can see by talking about it now, we're trying to sound the alarm early, over a year ahead of time, so that programs can start thinking about their services to the extent you need to modify service delivery, or if a staff person leaves, thinking about whether or not you want to replace that position. We would rather put that information out to you now, but certainly as we have more specific information about your program, we're going to share it. We received a few questions around our priorities areas that were specific to funding marginalized communities and geographic locations that already receive less funding. Questions like, curious about the processes that'll be put in place to support marginalized people and communities, or how will this reduction impact organizations that service undocumented immigrants? How will this impact programs in Western Mass that already receive less funding to cover larger service areas? So I'm going to ask Kristen, if you don't mind, if you can touch on these questions.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Liam. So our work is guided by our strategic plan, which clearly states that we're committed to improving services and supports for victims, survivors, and service providers by supporting culturally reflective, high-quality services that are accessible to all victims and survivors. We'll always strive to provide the funding, services, and access for underserved and marginalized communities and populations. And while at this time we can't be certain what the funding may look like, we can assure you that we are committed to ensuring there is support and funding for these communities. With that being said, MOVA, we're in the initial stages of planning a targeted procurement, which will begin in the second half of FY22. The purposes of this procurement that we're in the planning stages for will be to identify and support agencies and programs that do not currently receive VOCA funding, historically have not received VOCA funding or MOVA funding, and that they serve by and for marginalized populations. Our intent is to provide victim services funding to organizations that are culturally based, led by individuals from marginalized populations, and have a history of services to specific communities or cultures. We anticipate dedicating $1.7 million towards this initiative in FY22 and FY23, in addition to considering carving out future funding and future grant cycles as a priority to continue to support by and for programs. MOVA we're in the process of working with the consultant to lead our efforts in this area, and we'll continue to share more information as it's available. And I highly suggest if everybody is not already signed up for our constant contact updates, that is where we will announce any future grant opportunities. So I highly encourage everybody to sign up for those updates.
Thanks, Kristen. And I do want to take this moment to thank all of you that participated in our strategic planning process, whether it was through the focus groups or the surveys or on the advisory committee. We really benefited from the feedback we received and talking about who, frankly, we're serving well and who we're not. And so we hope to better identify some of that through our needs assessment and through these funding efforts. So I did want to address one last question that came in that I think is particularly relevant. And it's that victim stigma is reducing and reports are increasing since #MeToo attention. How do you reconcile increased demand with funding cuts? And that is a question that I don't have a very good answer for, other than to say we recognize the issue. We recognize the problem. We would like more VOCA funding from Congress, but right now that's not through formula, that's not the awards that we have. And so we recognize with you that you are working harder. You've always worked hard, and you're working harder than ever, both with the amount of survivors you're serving. So many of you had to shift your service models throughout a pandemic over the last year. And there are so many things pulling on you. And at this time is the time that funding coming into our state is reducing. And so I don't have a good answer as to make that okay, because it's not. But it is unfortunately the reality. So, but it is also what's motivating us to have this conversation today, over a year in advance, to talk about this with you, start this conversation, because this is the beginning of many, about how we can work to identify funding sources to help get through this. As Steph mentioned earlier, how we can work with our fellow state funders to maximize what each of us have to offer, the programs that we serve ultimately, and try to be collaborative to weather this through a period where hopefully at some point in the future, we'll see more VOCA funding coming in again. So I did want to answer that question. So at this time, we had hoped to only take a half an hour of your time with us talking, so that we can move on to your questions and answers that you raised today. So again, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A, and I'm going to do my best to read it and pass it on to one of my colleagues if I need to, or answer it myself. If we cannot answer your question, we'll do our best to respond and get back to you, even if to say we need to take more time before we can answer that question. So one question that we received was how much of the $40 million a year was in supplemental awards versus current or ongoing VOCA and Safe Plan awards? Kristen, did you want to take a stab at that, if you,
Sure.
you understand the question?
Yeah, and I did want to address one other question that I have seen a couple times. It looks like some of the attendees are having difficulty opening the Dropbox timeline. So if you are having difficulty with that link, we'll be sure to post that timeline on our website and share it with whoever may be unable to open it at this time. But to answer that question, Liam, so for our supplemental awards that we awarded out in FY20 and FY21, and I apologize, I'm looking at my other screen for these numbers, but we awarded approximately $3.5 million in emergency COVID funding, $2.7 million in supplemental housing awards to address housing instability during COVID. Access to Victim Rights Awards, we awarded $2 million towards that initiative. And for Safe Plan, we awarded $4 million last fiscal year.
Thanks, Kristen. And another question we received was, what is the process to relocate funds to other grantees if current grantees cannot use them and they would otherwise revert? So I think this was referencing earlier when I said, please don't revert money at the end of the year. If you think you're going to revert money, tell us now so we can put it to work. So I understand your question. What we do is, and this is very in the weeds MOVA stuff, but what we try to do is spend those dollars early in it's a budgeting piece, and by spending it early in our first quarter past July, we can spend those dollars down if we know about them and we can plan for them. Occasionally, if we know we're going to have too much, we can try to do a targeted procurement. But where we are in the year, where September is coming down upon us, that would be unlikely that we would be able to use these dollars for a targeted procurement. But typically, it's a budgeting thing that we do on the back end. The next question is, will the July 2022 to July 2023 extension be a closed bid process? Kristen, do you want to take that?
Sure. So we're still working on the details of what that extension will look like. But how we're envisioning it is that it will be a 1-year renewal for currently funded programs. So programs who do not currently receive funding from MOVA would not be eligible for that 1-year funding. And then we would push off the competitive procurement to begin on FY24. So I think that answers the question. It's a little vague because we're still working on the details of what that renewal may look like, but we will certainly provide announcements as we work through those details and what that would look like.
Thanks, Kristen. And Stephanie, the next question is for you. It was, can you just restate how much money is in the American Rescue Plan and for what purpose? Is it just EV related?
Sure. So Congress passed the bill last month and it included $49.5 million as an earmark to the National Health and Human Services Agency. So the challenge is it's $49.5 million across the country, and we're not sure yet what Massachusetts' cut of that pie will be, and that's what we're trying to determine. And yes, the way that it is written is that it is specifically for domestic violence and sexual assault victims impacted by COVID. It's relatively vague what that language is. So we're trying to get some additional information on what exactly that means and what exactly would be eligible, what types of services would be eligible for that funding.
And Kristen, I think this next question is for you. Will there be any adjustment or loosening of the new reporting requirements with our outcome measurement tool, given the anticipated reduction in funding available?
That's a great question. So at this time, I don't anticipate that there will be any changes to the outcome measurement tool, but we are in the process of revisiting our policies and procedures manual, and we're taking a look at some of the other administrative burdens that are placed on subrecipients. One of those being backup documentation requirements. So we're currently working to identify ways in which we can reduce backup for subrecipients who are generally in compliance with the grant requirements, and getting them to a place where they can reduce those backup requirements. And we hope through that we would be able to reduce some of those administrative burdens that are placed, especially in light of reduced funding. And in addition to that too, we're hopeful that the e-grant system, our new electronic grants management system, will address some of the nuances of grant reporting and will help streamline that process as well.
Okay. So the next question, Kristen, is going to go to you too, and it's essentially for the 1-year extension starting after this next fiscal year. Do you have any idea about percentage decreases?
Right now, we know that we're receiving a 35% reduction to our federal award, but what that means for each individual program, we're still working on those details. But it will be something within that vicinity.
Which is to say, we don't know that it, I just want to anticipate a question that may come on. We don't know that it's going to be 35% because we received a 35% reduction from the federal government. But we want you to know what we received from the federal government because it's significant, right? And so just the numbers shouldn't necessarily translate. There's a lot of work that we need to do on our end and with the needs assessment and with our board to better identify what the percentages are going to look like for programs. And when we do that, we'll definitely let you know. So we have a question about how is the increase in domestic violence during the pandemic being addressed in regards to funding? People are stuck in a home with their abuser, loss of jobs and kids in the home because of remote learning. And I think the answer to that, I know is felt by many of you on this call. There have been so many programs shifting how they do their work and how they provide services. And I know Jesse can probably speak to some of the work that our Safe Plan programs have seen. And I can tell you with our funding, we've tried to, when we had some increased funding, we tried to put that funding out for emergency services for crime victims, tried to support housing stabilization and other services. But Jesse, did you want to take a stab at anything else in response to that question?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay, well that's rare, but thank you, Jesse. So earlier I mentioned thanking folks for participating in our advisory committee for the strategic planning process, and so there's a question about how to apply for the advisory committee. So that committee is done for now. It was part of our strategic planning process that we wrapped up this past year. But we are always looking for feedback from individuals, from survivors, from programs. That's the reason we're doing the needs assessment. We're going to be doing a lot of survivor outreach as part of that. So certainly if you're interested in hearing from us when we're trying to get information from the community, please send us your email to mova@mass.gov, and we'll get you signed up with our listserv, and we'll definitely make sure we send that information to you. One participant wrote, I do appreciate all the work you have to do, but do you imagine reducing lots of agencies' funding or dropping funding altogether for some programs? And I think I'll take that question. As Kristen said, we are very early in figuring out what the process is and what the process is going to look like. And it would be wrong for us to say it's definitely going to do this or it's definitely going to do that. So I don't want to make that mistake. I don't want to unnecessarily send folks into a panic. And at the same time, I don't want to make promises we can't keep. And so let us take the time to figure out how best to, the funding that we have and how best to put it out to support programs and get real answers to those questions. I totally understand why you want to know them, but when we have that information, we'll definitely share it with you. Next question, how will the impact on the increasing immigrant community with little or limited access to health or limited health insurance to assist survivors? There, I mean, if I want to make sure I understand your question, but if I do, totally, there's a real need out there. This is like the earlier question about increased survivors reaching out to programs at a time that funding is going to be reduced. There's a lot of need, and it's going to take a lot of creativity and advocacy from all of us on this call to figure out how to support them and serve them. And knowing many of you that registered, I'm really grateful that you're the community I'm in this with, because I know that we can work together to address those needs, but there's definitely a lot of need out there. So there's a question about, can we explain why fines have been diverted from the VOCA fund over the past several years? So there was there's been an increase in what are called non-prosecution agreements, or non-prosecution agreements, where as the Justice Department, after bringing a case, would get to a place where they, rather than finding, it's often a corporation, we should say that, these big fines and fees come from corporations. They don't come from an individual being prosecuted in the federal courts. They come from, you know, Volkswagen. And I'm not saying anything poor about Volkswagen, but that happens to be one of the settlements that was out there some time ago. But it's a corporation, and what has happened with the Justice Department is, as they did with Boeing not too long ago, they reach an agreement where rather than finding the corporation guilty, there are fines and fees to the corporation, and the case is resolved. And in those instances, the fines go to the Treasury rather than the Crime Victims Fund. And so it's that discrepancy when we talk about the VOCA fix that we're trying to fix. We're trying to change so that, you know, if the Justice Department wants to do non-prosecution agreements, because that's what makes sense for the Justice Department, we totally understand that, and you know, they do what they do, but those fines and fees should go to crime victims. And so that's the VOCA fix that Steph so eloquently spoke about earlier. Will agencies with multiple programs have the ability to work with MOVA to determine where cuts will be least impactful, factoring in programs, other funding sources, etc.? Kristen, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, and I think the most simple way to answer that question is by engaging in our needs assessment process. That is how we would like programs to engage with us, and through any communication that we send out, whether it's surveys to identify what the funding priorities may be, or through our needs assessment. That is where I would encourage everybody to participate, to work with MOVA to determine where we would experience these cuts and where we would prioritize.
Thanks, Kristen. And we have a great idea here being offered in the question and answer. Given the Mr. Kraft's commitment and previous partnership with the Attorney General through their Game Change program a number of years ago, and the Kraft family's commitment to supporting victim services historically, might MOVA and the Attorney General consider approaching the Krafts to consider helping us bridge this gap, maybe a $1 to $2 multi-million dollar funding commitment? I think it's a great idea, and we're certainly happy to pass that on to the Attorney General as something we can talk about. So thanks for the suggestion, and I think it's that type of creativity that we all really need to come to this with. Who do we know, and how can we help them to support us until we can get the VOCA fix done and more money in the coffer? Since COVID is still significantly impacting everyday life, could you please explain why the COVID emergency funds need to be spent by the end of June? Kristen, do you want to take that?
Yeah, definitely. And I did see some questions about why programs may be unable to roll over funding this grant cycle. So I think I'll address both of those questions in this response. So the COVID emergency funds, that is part of our 2018 federal award, which in the projection chart, you'll see that was our $69 million award, which has historically been our largest award ever. So that is currently expiring on September 30th. So because of that expiration date, we are unable to extend those COVID emergency awards. And that is why you may have been hearing from your grant manager asking to plan out and project what the forecast for the next few months looks like to spend those awards down and to utilize those awards to the best of your ability. And same with the rollover piece. We knew when we initially released the FY21 and FY22 grant application that rollover would be something that we would not be able to support this cycle because of the anticipated decreases. And that was identified in the original RGA, which was pre-COVID. So because of this expiration date on our largest award, that is also why we are unable to support rollover during this time.
Thanks, Kristen. So we do have a question here about what percentage of the VOCA line will be committed to serving human trafficking survivors. So thank you for that question. We, as you know, as Kristen spoke about earlier, we have to, through the needs assessment and our outreach, come up with priorities. I think it's important mentioning, as many of you who have worked with VOCA before know that the federal government requires on states to fund 10%, at a minimum of 10% to child abuse, a minimum of 10% of our awards to domestic violence, a minimum of 10% of our award to sexual assault survivors, and then a minimum 10% to an underserved community that our board determined some time ago would be survivors of homicide victims. And so those are the only identified percentages that we have been working with historically. Certainly as we go into future funding streams, we're always reevaluating them to the extent that we can, and they're not required by the federal government, and we'll do that. But right now I can't answer the specific question about what percentage is going to be directed towards any one population other than the three in particular that the federal government requires of states. One question is, we are always underfunded when it comes to a total program cost. Will there be an opportunity for us to share actual costs on the ICF survey to show how large the need for this funding is? Thank you. That's a really great question, and it's a great tip off for us. And we will be sure to talk with the folks at ICF about that. And immediately following this, at I think at 11:30 today, and I'm hoping someone on my team will chat me if I'm wrong. We're doing a needs assessment webinar looking at heads nodding. So at 11:30 this morning. So if you haven't registered for that, I'd encourage you to check in on that one. Samantha Lowry from ICF will be presenting on the needs assessment today. And I would encourage you to bring up that question with her there. But even if you don't, we'll pass it along after today as well. I wanted to take the moment, if I could, to acknowledge there are a few things that were sent in the Q&A that were words of thank yous and shout outs to MOVA. And while I don't want to be self-congratulatory on it, I also don't want to miss the opportunity to thank so many amazing staff we have at MOVA, including our panelists today, Jesse, Stephanie, and Kristen, and Brenna and Charlotte who put this on. I'm really fortunate to work with so many amazing people on this, and I know we're grateful for your partnership. And so that is all the questions we have. It's 10:53. Why don't we give it a minute? Oh, here's a couple more. So if you have a question, why don't you send it in now so we can take those. Thanks for talking about actively strategizing with other state agencies about potential sources of money and strategies. Many of us, especially in domestic violence and sexual assault service providers, are members of Jane Doe. Are you also working with Jane Doe to strategize, et cetera? They hope that we will actively, collaborative minds, that they have a great team and know many of our needs. We regularly work with Jane Doe, and I know we have both about the VOCA fix. We've been reaching out to them actively to try to ask that be part of their policy agenda, and that they send out the same tweets that we do. We've been trying to share with them the information about the funding going down especially as an advocacy standpoint, because we really need all the voices, and Jane Doe definitely is a powerful voice. We can really use their advocacy on that, and they have given it. Certainly throughout this process that we're pretty much announcing today, we'll be reaching out to them as we are with our state agencies about what this process will look like going forward. We've got a long history of working with Jane Doe, so I'm confident that we'll continue to get to work together again. Next question, how much more is projected to be lost from the ongoing diversion of fees to the treasurer, if it can be projected? I don't think we entirely know that. I can tell you that the Congressional Budget Office that looks at bills and says, how much is this bill gonna cost? They determined that the VOCA fixed would cost the government between $8 and $10 billion over the next several years. And the reason for that, the reason they see a cost is because all of those funds that are diverted to the Treasury are now would now be going to the Crime Victims Fund. So the Congressional Budget Office, I guess, is saying over the next several years, it could be between $8 and $10 billion. I don't think we really know. There's so many things that factor into that. It matters how many cases the Justice Department has brought over the last 4 years, how many kind of are in the pipeline to be worked on. It matters how they are then resolved. And so I think right now there's a lot more questions than answers. We have asked the Department of Justice if they can, through the Office for Victims of Crime, if they can let us know, kind of what that pipeline looks like. We haven't gotten an answer yet. But if we do, certainly we'll be back with that answer because we'd like to know it too. Also, any collaboration work with the Mass Department of Public Health, Domestic Violence, Sexual Assault Unit? Yes, so when we say broadly our fellow state funders, that's exactly who we're talking about. Recently, we reached out to them and asked for a meeting for all of us to get together to talk through the impact of the VOCA cuts and if there was opportunities to collaborate and better support programs. And someone asked for a clarification. That was, yes, 8 to 10 billion with a B of dollars that the Congressional Budget Office suspected would be directed to the Crime Victims Fund rather than the General Treasury. We received a question about will CLAVIC funding for July 2022 be impacted by this VOCA decrease? Kristen, did you want to take that question? CLAVIC, yeah, of course, is our civil legal assistance for victims of crime project that we work collaboratively on with the Mass Legal Assistance Corporation, MLAC.
Yeah, I can answer that question. So at this time, similar to, CLAVIC is on the same boat as our other programs. I can say confidently that most, if not all, grant programs will experience some sort of reduction, including CLAVIC. So they are separate, again, a separate and distinct funding initiative, separate from the VOCA and SAFE Plan renewals. So theirs may look a little bit different than what we determine for our renewal grants, but I can confidently say at this time that most programs will experience a reduction.
Thanks, Kristen. And so with that, there's no more open questions in the queue, and we are at 10:58. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes back to yourselves. I really appreciate you all joining us today for this conversation. And what I said earlier is true. It's the beginning of a conversation. We really just wanted to make sure early we spoke with you and began the dialogue. It's not good news. It's not easy to say out loud, but we are genuine in wanting to work with you to try to overcome it. Because at the end of the day, we all get to come here because we want to serve crime victims and survivors in Massachusetts and make their lives better. And I know you do that day in and day out on very little money. And so I'm confident we can all work together to try to weather this over the coming years. So thank you for your time. Thank you for everything you do today. Please join us for the needs assessment session or take a look at our webpage and check out the many sessions we have over the rest of April, which again is Victim Rights Month. If you didn't have a chance to see it, we had an amazing session last Thursday with last week with our Attorney General, speaking with and interviewing Tarana Burke. It was remarkable, very inspiring to hear from her. We have a lot of great sessions from many of you in the community and others over the month. So please take a look at our webpage, sign up, and thanks. It's really great partnering with you on this work and on this journey. So stay well. I wish you and your families health and safety in the weeks and months ahead. Take care.